Something just happened online and it escalated way faster than anyone expected because what started as a series of bold accusations turned into a full-blown showdown the moment Candace Owens responded. And she didn't respond quietly. She came back with what she called receipts. Now, here's where it gets complicated because at the center of this situation are two names that suddenly started trending together. Alexis Wilkins, Erika Kirk, both have been facing online speculation and criticism, some of it intense, some of it controversial, and recently both pushed back publicly with serious claims of their own. Those claims, they accused Candace of being part of a coordinated effort against them. But instead of backing down, Candace flipped the entire narrative. She challenged the claims, invited a direct on-camera discussion, and suggested the accusations didn't line up with available evidence. According to reports and posts circulating online, the exchange quickly shifted focus from the original accusations to questions about timelines, public statements, and how different pieces of information fit together. And then something happened that made people pay even closer attention. One side kept posting, the other side went quiet. Now, before we go any further, this is important. Much of what's being discussed right now comes from online claims, threads, and interpretations, not confirmed conclusions. But that hasn't stopped the conversation from exploding. Because once people started comparing statements, responses, and timing, they felt like something didn't fully add up. And that's what pulled everyone in. Because this isn't just about accusations anymore, it's about who can actually back them up, and what happens when that challenge is made publicly. Because if you think this is just another online argument, what comes next might surprise you. To understand why this situation is blowing up the way it is, you have to rewind because this didn't start with one tweet, one clip, or one response. It started with pressure building over time, quietly in the background, and then suddenly it all came to the surface at once. At the center of it is Candace Owens, someone who's built a reputation on challenging narratives, asking uncomfortable questions, and not backing down when controversy hits. And because of that, she attracts attention, a lot of it. Supporters who back her no matter what. Critics who push back just as hard, and a constant stream of debates that never really die down. But this situation feels different because instead of a one-sided controversy, it turned into a direct clash of back and forth. And that's where the names Alexis Wilkins and Erika Kirk come in. Because according to the transcript you provided, both women have recently been facing online speculation and criticism, some of it intense, some of it controversial, and they didn't stay quiet about it. They responded publicly, directly, and not in a small way. They pushed back with strong accusations of their own. Now again, this is important. These are claims being made in online posts and threads, not verified conclusions. But what matters for understanding this story is how those claims were framed. Because instead of just denying criticism, they went further. They suggested there was something coordinated happening, that certain voices, including Candace, were part of a larger effort targeting them. And that framing, that's what changed everything. Because once you introduce the idea of coordination, people started looking for patterns, for connections, for timing. And that's exactly what happened here. Because within hours, people weren't just reacting emotionally anymore. They started analyzing, breaking down posts, comparing timelines, looking at who said what and when. And once that process begins, the story evolves. Because now it's not just about whether the claims are true or false, it's about whether they make sense. And that's where things started getting complicated. Because while those accusations were spreading, Candace Owens didn't respond the way people expected. She didn't ignore it. She didn't just deny it. She escalated it strategically. Because instead of getting pulled into a back and forth, she flipped the focus. She challenged the claims directly, asked for evidence, and most importantly invited a public conversation on camera, recorded, where everything could be laid out clearly. And that move was critical because it shifted the entire dynamic because now it wasn't just they said this, she said that. It became who can actually prove what they're saying. And that's a completely different level of conversation because once evidence becomes the focus, everything changes because claims can spread fast. But evidence, that's what people look for when things get serious. And that's exactly where the tension started building. Because according to your transcript, after that challenge was made, the responses didn't match the intensity of the original accusations. One side kept talking, the other side slowed down. And that shift didn't go unnoticed because in situations like this, silence gets interpreted rightly or wrongly. People see it as avoidance, strategy, or something more complicated. And once people start interpreting silence, the story grows. But here's where things go deeper. Because this isn't just about one exchange, it's about patterns. Because according to your transcript, people started noticing similarities between Alexis and Erika, similar timing in how they entered certain public circles, similar types of accusations being made, similar framing of themselves as targets, and similar responses when challenged. Now again, these are observations being made by people online, not confirmed facts. But in the world of viral content, patterns are powerful because they create narratives, and narratives drive attention. And attention is exactly what this situation has right now. A lot of it. Because once people feel like they're watching something unfold in real time, they stay locked in, waiting for the next move, the next response, the next piece of information that might clarify everything. And that's where we are right now. Because this story hasn't reached a conclusion. It's still evolving because we have strong accusations, a direct public challenge, ongoing analysis, and unanswered questions. And that combination, that's what keeps stories alive. Because until something is clearly resolved, people keep watching, keep questioning, keep trying to figure out what's really going on. Which brings us to the next part. Because what happened after that challenge was made is where things really started to escalate. And this is where everything shifts from a loud online argument into something that feels much more strategic because once Candace Owens stepped in and challenged the claims directly, the entire tone changed. Before that moment, it was chaos, threads, accusations, back and forth pose flying everywhere. But the second she said essentially, "Come on my show, present your evidence, let's talk about it on record," that's when things got serious. Because now the conversation wasn't about opinions anymore, it was about proof. And that's where the conflict really begins. Because according to the transcript, Alexis Wilkins had already made some very strong claims. Not small ones, not vague ones. We're talking about allegations involving coordinated influence, foreign link narratives, multiple high-profile figures. And when claims reach that level, they demand something in return. Evidence, verification, something that holds up under scrutiny. And that's exactly what Candace asked for publicly, clearly, and strategically. Because think about what that move does. It forces a decision. Either you show up and prove your claims or you don't, and let people interpret that however they want. And that's where the first twist hits, because instead of immediately accepting that invitation, there was no direct response, no confirmation, no scheduled appearance, just silence. And that silence changed everything. Because the moment a public challenge is issued and it isn't answered, people start asking questions. Not about the original claims, but about the response or lack of one. And that's exactly what happened here, because now the narrative shifted again from what was said to its seven. Why wasn't it defended? And that shift is powerful because it flips the pressure. Now, instead of Candace being on the defensive, the spotlight moved to Alexis Wilkins and Erika Kirk. And once that happens, everything gets reevaluated. Every claim, every post, every detail. But here's where the situation gets even more complicated. Because while the silence was being noticed, the original accusations didn't disappear. They were still out there, still circulating, still being shared. And that creates a strange dynamic because now you have strong claims without a direct follow-up response. And that combination keeps the story alive because people are stuck in the middle trying to figure out, do the claims hold weight, or does the lack of response say more, and there's no clear answer, which is exactly why the story keeps growing. But here's where the second twist comes in, because while all of this is happening publicly, another pattern starts getting attention: the similarities between Alexis and Erika. Now again, we have to be clear. These are observations people are making online, not confirmed conclusions. But the pattern people are pointing to is this. Both entered high-profile circles quickly. Both build strong public personas. Both face similar accusations. Both responded in similar ways. And now both are involved in the same conflict. And when people see that kind of overlap, they don't ignore it. They analyze it, they question it, they connect it. Whether those connections are valid or not, the perception is what matters. And right now, that perception is spreading fast because it gives the story structure, a narrative people can follow, a reason to stay engaged. But here's the part that really escalates everything. Because this situation isn't happening in isolation. It's happening in a space where audiences are already skeptical. Narratives are constantly challenged and information moves faster than ever, which means every detail gets amplified, every inconsistency gets noticed, every silence gets interpreted. And that's what's happening here. Because now people aren't just watching what's being said, they're watching how it's being handled, who responds, who doesn't, who engages, who steps back. And those behaviors, they become part of the story just as much as the claims themselves. But here's the key point, because at the center of all this is a simple but powerful question. Who can actually back up what they're saying? Because in a situation like this, that's what everything comes down to. Not opinions, not narratives, not speculation, proof. And right now, that proof hasn't been clearly presented in a way that resolves the situation, which means the conflict stays open. Because without resolution, there's no closure. And without closure, stories don't end. They evolve, they expand, they pull more people in. And that's exactly where we are right now. A situation that started with accusations turned into a challenge, and now sits in a space where claims exist. Responses are incomplete, and questions are getting louder. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because depending on what happens next, this could go in two very different directions. Either evidence comes forward and changes everything, or the silence continues and the narrative shifts even further. But based on how fast this is escalated, a lot of people don't think this is slowing down anytime soon. Because once a story reaches this level of attention, it doesn't just disappear. It builds and builds until something forces it to resolve. And right now, we're not there yet, not even close. And just when it felt like the situation had reached its peak, it took another turn. Because the longer the silence continued after that public challenge from Candace Owens, the more people started digging, not just into the claims themselves, but into everything surrounding them. Because at this point, the conversation wasn't just about what Alexis Wilkins and Erika Kirk said. It became about context, background, patterns, and how everything fits together or doesn't. Because once people feel like something isn't fully explained, they don't stop at the surface, they go deeper. And that's exactly what started happening here. Old posts resurfaced, past affiliations got brought up, public appearances were re-examined. And suddenly the conversation became much bigger than the original accusations. Because now it wasn't just about one situation, it was about consistency. Because people began asking, do the statements match past actions? Do the timelines line up? Does the response match the severity of the claims? And those questions, they don't have easy answers, which is why the story kept escalating. But here's where the shocking reveal comes in. Because what really changed how people viewed the situation wasn't a new claim, it wasn't a new post, it was the absence of one. Because when someone makes strong accusations and then doesn't follow up when challenged, that gap becomes the focus. And that's exactly what happened here. Because the longer there was no direct engagement with that public invitation, the more people interpreted it. Some said it was strategic, others said it was avoidance, and some believed it meant something deeper. But regardless of interpretation, one thing was clear: the spotlight had shifted. And once the spotlight shifts like that, it's very hard to move it back, because now the conversation isn't just about what was said, it's about what wasn't defended. And that's a completely different dynamic. But here's where things get even more intense. Because while all of this is happening publicly, another layer is building behind the scenes, the narrative itself. Because at this point, the story is split into multiple versions. One version says this is a coordinated situation that needs to be exposed. Another version says this is a series of claims that haven't been backed up, and both of those versions are spreading at the same time, which means the audience isn't just watching one story, they're watching competing narratives, and that creates tension because now every new detail gets interpreted differently depending on which side people believe, which is exactly why this situation hasn't slowed down, because there's no single conclusion, no agreed upon truth, just claims. It is bones and interpretations. But here's the part that really defines this escalation. Because this isn't just
least
about the individuals
understood
involved
or
anymore.
thought that it was
It's about how
strange.
information is
Your
handled in
senses
public.
maybe started
Because this
tingling.
situation highlights something bigger: the difference between making a claim and proving it. Because in the digital space, claims can spread instantly, but proof takes time. And when that gap exists, that's where narratives grow, that's where speculation builds, and that's where stories like this gain momentum. But here's the reality check. Because despite everything that's been said, everything that's been shared, everything that's been analyzed, there is still no clear resolution, no definitive moment that ties everything together. And that's what keeps this situation alive, because unanswered questions don't end stories, they extend them. And right now there are a lot of unanswered questions. Which means this isn't the final stage, it's the escalation stage, the point where attention peaks, where more people get involved, where the pressure builds, and where the next move becomes critical. Because whatever happens next will determine how this entire situation is remembered. Because if something new comes out, something clear, something verifiable, then everything shifts. But if nothing comes, if the silence continues, then the narrative continues to evolve on its own. And that's the part nobody can control. Because once a story reaches this level, it doesn't need new information to keep going. It feeds off interpretation. And interpretation is already everywhere, which means this situation is far from over. In fact, it might just be getting started. At this point, the situation didn't just stay between a few posts and responses. It exploded, because once the clips, threads, and breakdowns started circulating, people didn't just watch, they picked a side. And just like every major controversy, the internet split instantly. On one side, you had people backing Candace Owens. They were saying, she asked for proof, that's fair. If the claims are that serious, they should be backed up. Inviting a public conversation was the right move for them. This wasn't complicated. They saw someone making strong accusations and someone else asking for those accusations to be proven. And in their eyes, the lack of a direct follow-up response only made those questions louder. But then there was the other side, and they weren't holding back either. They argued not every response needs to happen on someone else's platform. Silence doesn't automatically mean anything. This is being turned into something bigger than it is. In that perspective also gained traction, because in situations like this, interpretation plays a huge role. What one person sees as avoidance, another sees as strategy. What one person sees as proof, another sees as pressure. And that's what keeps the conversation alive, because there's no single lens. There are multiple, and each one creates a different version of the same story. But it didn't stop with fans. Content creators jumped in fast, breaking down timelines, reposting clips, comparing statements, trying to piece together what might actually be going on. And once that happens, the story gets even bigger because now it's not just reactions, it's analysis. Different creators building different narratives from the same set of events. Some focusing on the challenge, others focusing on the silence, others focusing on the broader patterns people think they're seeing. And each version feels convincing to the audience watching it, which creates even more division. But here's where things take another turn. Because while the online debate is growing louder, industry voices are starting to react too. Not always directly, not always with names, but with subtle posts, statements that feel connected without confirming anything. Things like, when claims get serious, evidence matters. Timing doesn't lie, but interpretation changes everything. And the timing of those posts didn't go unnoticed because even without direct references, people connected them to what was happening, which added another layer of intensity because now it feels like the situation isn't just being debated, it's being watched by people with influence, by people who understand how these narratives play out, and that attention only makes everything bigger. But here's the part that really defines this moment, because through all the debates, all the breakdowns, all the reactions, one thing still hasn't changed. Alexis Wilkins and Erika Kirk have not directly engaged with that original public challenge. No recorded discussion, no detailed follow-up addressing the points raised. And that absence is still the center of the conversation because the longer it continues, the more people speculate, the more theories form, the more attention the story gets. And that's what makes this moment so powerful. Because it's not just about what's been said, it's about what hasn't been addressed. And in situations like this, that gap becomes the story. Which leads to the biggest question everyone is asking right now: what happens next? Because right now, this situation is sitting in a very specific place. Not resolved, not dismissed, just open. And when a story stays open like that, it doesn't fade. It grows because people keep checking for updates, keep refreshing, keep waiting for something that finally moves the story forward. And based on how intense this has already become, a lot of people believe we haven't seen the biggest moment yet. Because in situations like this, the silence doesn't last forever. And when it breaks, it usually changes everything. And just when it feels like every angle has been argued, every clip dissected, and every post analyzed, this is where the story flips. Because the biggest twist isn't what was said by Candace Owens. It's what that public challenge actually did to the entire situation. It changed the rules. Because before that moment, everything was moving fast. Claims, counterclaims, threads, reactions. But after that invitation to present evidence on record, everything slowed down. And when things slow down in a story like this, people start paying closer attention to details, to timing, to who moves next. And that's where the real tension comes in. Because right now, this situation isn't being driven by new information. It's being driven by anticipation. Everyone is waiting, watching, trying to see who makes the next move. Because that next move will define everything. But here's the twist most people aren't thinking about. Because this isn't just about one exchange between a few individuals. It's about credibility. Because once a situation reaches this level, it stops being about who said what and becomes about who can stand behind it publicly, clearly with something that holds up under scrutiny. And that's where things get complicated because right now there are two realities forming at the same time. One says the original claims raised important questions that still need answers. The other says those claims needed proof and haven't been fully backed up yet. And both of those realities are growing simultaneously, which means this story doesn't have one direction. It has multiple. And that's why it feels so unpredictable because depending on what happens next, either side could gain momentum. But here's the part that should really make you think. Because the longer the situation stays unresolved, the more the narrative shifts away from the claims themselves and toward the response or lack of one. Because in the absence of new information, people don't stop talking, they start interpreting. And interpretation is where stories take on a life of their own. Because once enough people start filling in the gaps, those interpretations become the narrative. And that's very hard to reverse, which is why this moment is so critical because whoever moves next controls the direction. If Alexis Wilkins or Erika Kirk respond directly, present evidence, or engage publicly, the entire conversation shifts again. If they don't, then the focus continues to move away from the original accusations and toward the silence itself. And that's where things get locked in. Because once a narrative settles like that, it sticks. It shapes how everything is remembered. But here's the reality. Right now, we don't have a final answer. We don't have a definitive resolution. We don't have that one moment that ties everything together. What we have is strong claims, a direct challenge, ongoing analysis, and a very visible pause in responses. And that combination doesn't end stories. It extends them. Which means this isn't the end, not even close. Because situations like this don't just disappear, they build, they evolve, they reach a point where something has to happen, a response, a clarification, a piece of information that changes how everything is viewed. And when that happens, it doesn't just add to the story, it reshapes it. So now the only question left is this: who moves next? Because whoever does is going to decide how this entire situation plays out. And based on everything we've seen so far, that moment might be closer than we think. Now, I want to hear from you because this is one of those situations where everyone sees it differently. After everything involving Candace Owens, Alexis Wilkins, and Erika Kirk, what do you think is really going on? Do you believe the original claims raise serious concerns that still need answers? Or do you think the focus should be on whether those claims have actually been proven? Be honest, because right now the internet is completely split on this. Some people are focused on the accusations, others are focused on the lack of follow-up, and both sides feel strongly about it. So, where do you stand? And more importantly, why? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading everything and I want to see how you're breaking this down. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because if anything changes in this situation, if someone responds, if new details come out, you already know we're going to cover it immediately. And trust me, with everything still unresolved, there's a very good chance this story isn't over. So stay locked in, because the next update might be the one that changes